All right, next bone is the ethmoid bone, and that will be the last of the bones of the skull that we will look at here. I think that's the last of all the bones of the skull, other than the ear bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes of the middle ear. The ethmoid bone is kind of an odd-shaped cube bone that's found right here between the two eye sockets. So if you can imagine the space between my fingers there and what I'm kind of holding on to there, the bone right between my fingers is the ethmoid bone. It's a little cube that just rests between the eyes. For the most part, that bone is just pockets of air with a small plate on either side. So notice that it makes up that medial wall of the orbit. You can kind of get a sense of that there, that medial wall right there. And it's mostly air pockets or sinuses there. So it's, if you could see the inside of that, it's just these clusters of small pockets in the bone or sinuses. And then running up through that, the middle of that block is this plate right here, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. And it goes up through the center of that block of bone, and then it emerges here in the anterior cranial fossa, right here, as this little ridge right there. Okay, this is called the crista galli, that portion of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. And on either side of it, you'll find these small perforated plates that are the cribriform plate. And those little openings will transmit the olfactory nerves going down into the nasal cavity. All right, so that's the ethmoid bone. Now you've got most of the bones of the skull, and one of the favorite exam questions that you encounter a lot of times with anatomy of the head and neck is they'll ask, which bones are responsible for forming the orbit of the eye. And if you ever encounter this question, the answer is phlegms, F-L-E-M-Z-S, phlegms. That's the acronym that helps you remember which bones form the orbit. So that, of course, that stands for frontal, lacrimal, ethmoid, maxillary, zygomatic, and then sphenoid forms this kind of posterior part back there. So F-L-A-M-Z-S, frontal, lacrimal, ethmoid, maxillary, zygomatic, and sphenoid are all parts of that. Occasionally, a portion of the palatine bone will also be found forming a little teeny pocket of bone right here in the back, as part of the palatine bone comes up into the eye socket here as well. So F-L-E-M-Z-S, and sometimes P for palatine. All right, we're going to finally move to the mandible as the last major bone we're going to look at. And I'll just go through a few of the bony parts here for this. The mandible itself is made up of kind of the body of the mandible, and then you have this portion here, which is called the ramus. Ramus, which refers to the idea of the place where something will split. And what's splitting up here is going to be this anterior condyloid process, or coronoid process, and a posterior condyloid process here. The condyloid process is the one that will articulate with the mandibular fossa on the underside of the temporal bone. The coronoid process here is the attachment point of the temporalis muscle. Between the two, you'll see the mandibular notch. Okay, so again, the body, the ramus, coronoid process, and the condylar process. On the body, right here near the chin portion, is the mental foramen. This will transmit the mental nerve. That's a continuation of the mandibular nerve that's passing through the jaw and giving sensation to the lower teeth. And then that nerve will emerge from here and give sensation to the skin of the lower jaw and that region there. Now if we flip this around so that we can see the opposite side of the ramus here, you can see that on the inside of that ramus you see this opening here. That's the mandibular foramen. That's where the mandibular nerve will enter, and then it will go through the body of the mandible and then come out through the mental foramen on that side. So you can kind of get a sense of that. Now, a lot of times on these models, you'll see a little bit of a spike of bone just at the opening there. And that little spike of bone is called the lingula, which means tongue. Not because of its relationship to the tongue, but because of its similarity in appearance to a small tongue. That little lingula is the attachment point of a ligament called the sphenomandibular ligament that we'll talk about later on. Like the maxilla, the mandible has these little pockets where the roots of the teeth will go. These are also known as alveolar processes. If we look at the front part of the mandible here, you can kind of get a sense that it's formed from two pieces that are joined together here in the midline. That little ridge there that represents where those two pieces have fused is called the mental symphysis. The mental symphysis. And then finally, it looks like I missed one term. This portion right here is the angle of the mandible. So it's that part where the body kind of turns and goes up towards the ramus. So that's the angle of the mandible, or sometimes the angle of the jaw. Okay, as I mentioned before, the only other bones associated with the skull are the auditory ossicles, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, but you don't have to worry too much about those.